Hey there, we're just going to give people a couple more minutes to come in before we get started. Thanks again for joining us today. Okay, and welcome back to the Housing Summit 2.0 Progress Report. This event is presented by RESCON and sponsored by the Toronto Regional Real Estate Board and the Federation of Rental Housing Providers of Toronto. My name is Amina Dibe. I'm the Manager of Government and Stakeholder Relations with RESCON, and I will be the moderator for the panel discussion today. I'd like to remind everyone to leave your thoughts on the community board, see who else is attending in the attendee section, and check out the documents shared in resources and visit our sponsored page. Of course, not right now, after this panel and after the event. So you can tune into this really exciting discussion. As always, if you have any technical issues during the event, please email our event manager, sarah@actualmedia.ca. During the session, if you have any questions, please type them into the chat and we will get them to our speakers for the Q&A portion at the end. Now I'd like to introduce Mike Moffatt of Smart Prosperity Institute, Eric Lombardi of More Neighbours Toronto, and Kris Hornburg with the City of Toronto for our panel discussion on outstanding housing reforms needed to increase supply. So I'll just kick it over first to Kris Hornburg to briefly introduce himself.
Perfect. Thanks very much, Amina. And maybe just before I start, I just want to say thanks to RESCON for hosting the event, having me on the panel. This is the second one I've done here, and pretty excited to be here. So as Amina said, my name is Kris Hornburg. I'm the Director of Process and Performance for the Concept to Keys Group, the City of Toronto. For those that don't know, Concept to Keys is really the business transformation arm of development review within the city. Our mandate is inherently kind of cross-divisional, and it's really to improve customer service and experience for all stakeholders. And so for me, my stakeholders, that includes both developers, applicants, and staff. And we improve these things through new processes, technologies, governance structures, and more, and all of which I'll hopefully get a chance to talk about a little bit today. So with that, I just want to say off the bat, my portfolio isn't directly responsible. I don't have a mandate for increasing housing supply, but instead I do so indirectly by making application processes faster, easier, and then I think also more consistent across the city. But at the same time, working with key partners to ensure good planning remains a factor. So I'll leave it there, but looking forward to the discussion.
Super, thanks, Kris. And Mike, I'll just kick it over to you now to introduce yourself.
Hi, so my name is Mike Moffatt. I'm the Senior Director of Policy at the Smart Prosperity Institute, a think tank housed at the University of Ottawa. Our mandate is to look at any sort of policy issues that have both an environmental and an economic component. So obviously housing is a big one. And we're delighted to be here today and have an in-depth discussion about Ontario's housing needs.
And last but not least, Eric.
Hi, my name is Eric Lombardi. I'm from More Neighbours Toronto. We are a not-for-profit and non-partisan, I'd say multi-partisan advocacy organization that is advancing the policy case to end the housing crisis afflicting our city and therefore our province.
Super. So my first question is for Kris, and throughout the discussion, if the other panelists want to jump in politely and just comment on anything that anyone has said, feel free to do so. But anyways, Kris, what is C2K or Concept to Keys, and what are you doing, and what is the C2K team doing to address housing supply in the city?
Yeah, certainly. So, I briefly mentioned again, like when I'm talking about this, right, I'm going to talk about it more from an indirect perspective, right? As Concept to Keys is this transformation program, right? It's not necessarily increasing housing supply as the core mandate, but I think there are some things that are within the core mandate that help achieve that outcome regardless. So if I, personally think about what developers and what staff need to deliver housing within the city, I think there's kind of three things that kind of jump to mind that I think everybody benefits from and everybody wants. And I think that's kind of predictability, accountability, and transparency, among other things. But I think those kind of rise to the top for me. And collectively, it's those improvements that can contribute to advancing development review. And as a result, or by extension, support, quicker timelines, and then increasing the housing supply in Toronto. And so maybe, just one example of something that Concept of Keys is operationalizing is a new operating model within the city of Toronto. So if you think about the current operating model of kind of development review, you have what is kind of a geographic or dispersed roster-based model, whereby an application comes in and based on a number of factors, but certainly one of the most being capacity, is passed on to a specific planner. And that planner will then work with an engineer or transportation specialist to move it through the city's system. And there's about 44 different commenting partners if you include all the external agencies in the province and everybody that has to comment. And one of the challenges with that model is you don't develop a lot of camaraderie. And there's other challenges as well. And I'll kind of get into those as I talk about the team-based model that we're looking to introduce. And so if you think about that model I just described, this team-based model that Concept of Keys is overseeing is where you take one planner and they will work with one of two engineers, and the ratios might change, and they might change based on where the file is being submitted. But generally speaking, one of two engineers, or say one of four transportation specialists, and then you can kind of go down that list of other commenting partners like Toronto Water and whatnot. And what you do that way is you have a planner develop camaraderie with one of two engineers. You also create joint responsibility and joint accountability. So instead of having horizontal accountability structures, you create vertical ones, which is again something. So now if you have a priority that comes from the top, you can actually have both people have that same priority within their kind of sphere of influence. The other thing that I think that does, and we've kind of heard this as feedback, is it's not, given the size of the city, it's not atypical that one planner might work with one engineer once a year. On a team-based model, you work with that same person way more often. So you learn as a planner, what makes it harder. And I shouldn't be picking on them, I'm just bringing them up as examples, but you learn as a planner, what makes it harder for an engineer to do their job, and vice versa. And through that, you can establish, say, some efficiencies. And lastly, I'd say there's this kind of function the Concept of Keys is developing, which is this application management function. And that's going to kind of sit on top of this, well, not on top of, but beside the planner. And that's kind of the process arm that I was talking about. And so the planner is without a doubt still the person that leads the file in the application, but now you have Concept of Keys that can help with, say, administrative tasks, community consultations, other things that take away from development review time that, again, Concept of Keys can help with. And that also establishes a direct delivery mechanism for new technology and process improvements. So again, maybe I'll leave it there, but that's one of the things that I think, again, we're helping with indirectly.
Super. Yeah, it sounds like it's a lot of it is removing barriers. And so it's a good segue into my question for Mike. The province, and I mean, it's been discussed during the summit, but the provincial government has set a target of building 1.5 million new homes over the next 10 years. Do we really need that many? And if so, what are the barriers to getting there and achieving that goal?
Yeah, so we, and thank you for the question. We studied this at SPI because this is a big number. I mean, this is sort of double the previous 10 years. And we were hoping to find that actually we didn't need that many. We were hoping that we would get a lower number. And so, we looked at the demographic data. We took some projections from the Ontario Ministry of Finance as far as population goes. And we found that basically to keep up with population growth, we're going to need about 1.1 million homes. And then to deal with the existing shortage of housing in Ontario, we need about 400,000. So our model spit out 1.506 million. And we actually thought it was a mistake at first. We're like, how did these two numbers get to be so close? But the short answer is yes. And I think we've already heard some of the big issues around that. So obviously around like zoning and planning process and approval speeds. I think one of the big things on that is if you took every Ontario official plan, the ones that have been submitted, and you added up all of their housing forecasts, so like how many Toronto says they'll build in Ottawa and London and so on, you don't even get a number that approaches 800,000. right? So it's like, how can the parts not equal the whole? So Ontario says we're going to build 1.5 million, but all the municipalities in Ontario together say, well, actually, our plan is to build half that. We need to change that alignment. But that said, even if we fix that overnight, if we can wave a magic wand, there's still issues. There's still issues with the labor side. CMHC released a fantastic report earlier today. I suggest that everyone look into it, but basically going, we don't have enough skilled trades people. And in fact, with the rate that they're retiring, we might not even be able to build as many homes as we did over the last 10 years, let alone increase that. So there's big issues there. Obviously, interest rates, supply chain issues, and some of the things mentioned earlier. And I would also suggest that this kind of slowness of innovation in the sector. We don't really build cars the same way we did in the 1950s, or airplanes, or a lot of other things. But a lot hasn't changed so much in the home building sector, particularly for single detached and semi-detached. So I think innovation plays a role. The private sector has a role in that, but I think we need more government policies to incent innovation. Look at the building code and find ways to build more climate-friendly, family-friendly housing faster, requiring less labor.
Yeah, it's I guess a lot of the work I do at RESCON is on the labor supply and like training and education side, and we've really been advocating to basically anyone who will listen to us that yes, there is a huge it's coming labor supply shortage, but a lot of these shortages will be in the voluntary trades. And
I'd add to that, I'm the son of a 75-year-old sheet metal worker who used to do HVAC work, and he still occasionally gets calls, and you see a lot of his colleagues are his age or a little bit younger, and that's just not sustainable.
Yeah, so there's some. It's not just, there's more than just the 1.5 million homes. It's what goes behind building that, which is another good segue. So it's the provincial government has set this target, but Eric, in your opinion, which level of government do you think is the most accountable to the housing crisis and really has the most ability to change things?
Yeah, so in my perspective, this really sits with the provincial government. I know historically we have left a lot of decisions around land use planning and building to the individual municipalities, but when you have one municipality that's failing to meet the provincial housing needs, that's a municipality problem. When all of your municipalities are failing to meet provincial housing targets, that is a province problem, right? And the reason is that the incentives at the local level towards building more housing simply do not exist. And we can talk a lot about process at the local level. I think it would help, especially if planners were compensated appropriately so they actually want to work for the city and planning department. But fundamental issue here is on this issue, we need change, and we also need residents of Ontario to accept that change in their neighborhood is normal and should be expected at a reasonable rate over time. We have seen sort of the coddling of the provincial mind when it comes to housing as an issue, and it will require provincial leadership to actually be able to strongly say, look, we know that change is not something you want, but we have this crisis. It is going to be very devastating for our economy and our society and sustainability of all the other systems that the province has invested in, including things like healthcare and education, because you want to talk about healthcare crises. Well, when you have a staff shortage of nurses and personal support workers who can't afford to live in Toronto, you are never, ever going to fix that problem, no matter how much money you throw at it, because they will not be able to justify their domestic lives in the city. So this is becoming a absolutely critical part of our long-term prosperity. And if we don't do something fast, we are really going to be in a lot of pain. We can talk about the labor supply issues as well, and I think they are incredibly important. And this gets brought up all the time to say, well, I mean, even if we change zoning laws, we still have this other issue. But industries and labor can't align to actually develop skills and innovations that are required if the policy framework and the incentives there don't exist yet, right? They can't bet on that happening some point in the future. We actually need to see the reforms happen first, right? And then if you can enter an era where there's actually competition between developers for consumers of housing and not competition to build housing with the government, you might actually see the incentive to innovate in these markets start to appear. But right now, there is no incentive towards innovation because they are not competing for customers of housing. If they build it, they will come. They are competing right now with the right to build housing in our cities. And that's a fundamental issue that the province can change. Finally, standardization of the rules at the provincial level will enable the investment into systems that will actually make the development application process more seamless. You know, Kris is talking about doing this at the city level, but when you have firmer rules and real guidelines that are enforced provincially, you can actually invest in better systems that can be shared across municipalities. And that will actually lower the cost and speed up the development on the features that those systems can have in the first place. So I really think that the province, in a lot of ways, has punted some of the accountability down to the municipal level, just because it's hard from a political perspective to sell that change at the provincial level. They don't want to be responsible for it, but neither do the municipalities. But the municipalities aren't going to do it on their own. They need provincial, help, and that's why they're the most accountable, in my perspective.
Yeah, I'll just pause there in case Kris or Mike want to jump in. But it does sound like, yeah, there's a lot of leadership that needs to come from all levels of government, but just to stay on theme.
Yeah, and I would agree with Eric, because, let's say you're a small community, let's say you're Tillsonburg, Ontario, and you do absolutely everything right on housing, zoning, you have the best approvals process in the world, so on and so on. All you're going to get is more families moving in from the GTA. You are never going to be able to solve the local affordability issues in that community. Ontario only works at the sort of speed of its least nimble municipality. So we absolutely need the province to bring everyone up, because I see actually so many municipalities trying to do the right thing across Southwestern Ontario, trying to address this affordability crisis, but they can't, because they just get swamped by more U-Hauls kind of coming in. We need to be able to solve this province-wide.
Yeah, and I like that I think there's a lot of doom and gloom now, especially surrounding housing. And I'm glad that you are mentioning municipalities, groups, organizations, whatever, who are doing the right thing, quote unquote, to get more housing supply built in their communities. But just kind of sticking to this province collaborating with municipalities, etc. Kris, from your perspective, what do you think the province can do to support municipalities to increase housing supplies? Obviously, speaking from your perspective at the City of Toronto.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I agree with what Eric's saying there in terms of what we need in terms of leadership from the province. And one of the things that comes up all the time for us is, so right now C2K is undergoing procurement for a new e-permitting system, right? And we obviously engage with our municipal partners to see what systems they're using. We're in the middle of that right now. But if I think about that, and one of the things that people have talked to me about is, like, a lot of countries do that at the state level. And so they mandate a system that all municipalities would have to use, right? And so that does a number of things. One, I think, it'd actually be a benefit to municipalities, but how you implement it, to me, is kind of the key, right? That's where I think you can kind of get municipalities on board or not. And so I think about phased approaches. I think about flexibility in terms of saying, within 5 years, join our system if they do the procurement, because that way there'd be no sunk cost for municipalities, right? And we could join their systems while still having, the service contracts on ours expire. I think about the fact that you could phase it in particular areas, like just the DTHA as an example. Or you could even ask municipalities, hey, who wants to join to start as a pilot? I think that would be something that could go really well. And if I think about that as a benefit, say from the provincial side, I mean, they'd have access to all this data that they probably don't have right now, which could be quite useful. And I actually think municipalities, if I got that, if somebody had said that to me, hey, you don't have to do this procurement, it's already been done, that would have made, I think, our life a little bit simpler as well, right? So I think from that perspective, it could be a benefit. Not talking about, of course, there's challenges with that type of a model as well. But again, I think if you offer some of that flexibility, that could be a really unique thing.
And so I'm going to shift gears a bit and talk about, or ask questions about, the NIMBY versus YIMBY impact on housing and planning bylaws, et cetera, and what housing does and doesn't get built. So I'm going to start with Eric, because this is really his bread and butter. But how do you bring homeowners and what we would call regular people, retirees even, along for the yes in my backyard ride, or get them to buy into some of the reforms that more Neighbours and some other groups are advocating for?
Yeah, so I do think what our political leaders have really failed at doing is making the case for why this should be important to regular people as well, those who already have their homes. I mean, like, I think about my parents, and they're in suburban GTA. They've lived in their house for 30 years, and the concept of having more people living in the neighborhood means traffic is going to get worse, and it's going to become a car-invested zoo like Vaughan. My parents live in Vaughan, but that's something my mom would say. And I don't think what our leaders have done really well is actually help people understand the benefits of having more people being able to live in their neighborhoods, and also more flexibility on what kinds of amenities can exist in that neighborhood. So if you allow, for example, small retail alongside multiplexes, or on bus routes, small apartments, you're going to have more of the third places where you can interact with your neighbors and meet people. You're going to make more trips without taking your car, and other people are going to be doing more trips without taking their car. And so there isn't actually this association between more neighbors and more cars, but people definitely have that assumption, purely based on the way that we build new housing in the province, right? I also think you really need to connect it to some of the aspirations that people have in their own personal lives. People might see their housing as their own investment, but if you are 50, 60 years old and you have kids that are, late teens, early 20s, and you're just wondering, like, how are they going to get started in life? Like, am I going to be able to have grandkids? Like, that ladder of opportunity has been so visibly pulled up. And what does your home equity mean if you have to take out $150,000 from it on a HELOC to give it to your kids so that they can afford a house, right? Like, people have not always made the connection that these things really do affect them, but we know that they do. And what's important is, my biggest gripe at our political level is our politicians are waiting for the population to get on the train, but they're not actually putting the effort to actually educate people about what it actually means, what these reforms mean for them, and not just about it being for other people who want housing, but in the many ways that their lives are going to become better as a result. And there's a huge case, moral and ethically and environmentally, to make that we're all going to have better lives. Even those who are housing right now, 20 years from now, will be better off if we do this. And we need the leadership to say and educate people on that reality.
Yeah, I don't know, Mike, if you want to jump in, because it's a very
absolutely
zero-sum.
Yeah, and I think the same way that I think there's a certain level of defeatism that often happens, because we think it's like, okay, when you look at the municipal level, like about 3/4 of voters are homeowners and 1/4 aren't. So we can't really do anything for that other quarter, because then we'll annoy the 3/4 of homeowners, and it turns into this kind of zero-sum thing. So I think we need to stop talk, or at least need to shift the discussion a little bit about how building more housing is good for other people, like Eric said, and say, no, how is building more housing good for existing homeowners? Partly that's like, hey, you can get your 25-year-old out of your basement, or it could be like, hey, if you have more housing in your neighborhood, your kid wouldn't have to move 100 miles away and you would never see your grandkids. But as well, I also think there's this assumption that I think we need to look at, that the existing housing market works for homeowners. And the one thing I hear a lot from people in my parents' generation is they're like, well, yeah, my house is worth a lot, but I can't actually do anything with the money unless I take out a HELOC or something. But I spent my whole career trying to get out of debt. I don't want to go back in debt, and so I would love to have the opportunity to cash out of that, but I can't. And the reason why I can't is there's nowhere for me to downsize to in the neighborhood I'd like. So I actually really think we should be focusing on how to create more seniors friendly housing in the neighborhood that seniors want to live in, because that would be good for them, but it would also unlock all of those homes like Eric's parents live in, to the next generation. Because if you look at, and would help us optimize our infrastructure as well, because in a lot of those neighborhoods, the average age of the population's in the 70s. There's a local neighborhood school that's either half empty or they're having to bus kids in from 5 or 10 kilometers away. So if we can get more young families into existing neighborhoods, we can use those schools. We don't have to build as many new schools. We don't have to bus the kids as far, which solves some of the traffic issues that Eric has. So I think we need to be a little bit creative and really get out of this mindset that it's zero sum of existing homeowners versus people who would like to be homeowners.
Yeah, and what I'm hearing is like kind of creating more complete communities so that people don't have to leave where they are, or people who are can stay in the town as they age. And so I'll kick it back to Eric. So we all know that More Neighbours is primarily a pro-housing organization, but I think recently, at least from what I've seen on Twitter, you're advocating for a lot more than just housing. So maybe, I don't know if you want to talk a bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, happy to. So I think, our politics has treated housing in general as like one issue among many issues. And I think those of us who have spent a lot of time on this issue, and frankly, to me, it just like boggles my mind that we've gotten ourselves into this horrible situation in the first place. But the reality is that housing is an everything issue. Like if you want to talk about issues around fertility, like why we need to have high immigration rates, the fact is, I don't care how much childcare benefits you provide, if people in my generation can't afford that extra bedroom of space to have a kid, they're not going to, right? If you think about climate change, we know that in our cities, 90% of emissions are moving people and heating buildings, right? 90%. So how can we think about solving our climate crisis if we don't think about the 90% of emissions that come from moving people and heating buildings? And that's absolutely a housing issue. How can we think about homelessness when, this housing crisis in general, what has occurred is every rung on the ladder becomes wider from the other. So if you have housing and you're in a housing that doesn't meet your needs, the next ladder up, that next rung is just way higher, right? And so in a lot of ways, people get trapped in whatever housing that they have at that moment. But the worst problem is once you fall off that housing, that first rung is just so much harder to reach. And we know that our cities aren't investing enough in housing for those who need help, right? Like there is this idea, I think, on homelessness issues in particular, that it should be self-help, but we know that's not really true. There are so many other issues, right? Like we're talking a lot about our healthcare issues and that we have staffing shortages for nurses and doctors and personal support workers. One problem, just like housing, is you have one part of the government limiting the number of laborers that can be produced in the province through our education systems. There is an underinvestment in labor supply there, but at the same time, a lot of people don't want to become a nurse if they can't afford them the lifestyle and domestic dreams that they want outside of their profession. People are more than their profession, and we have to recognize housing is fundamental to someone's perception of their own quality of life and fundamental to their domestic dreams and therefore their decisions in their career and specialization, right? So, all of these issues make housing, an everything issue. And so I subscribe to this housing theory of everything. And I think for More Neighbours, it's very clear that we have to have a voice on all the issues that housing touches because we need people to understand how connected that they are. Sorry, that was a long answer.
No, it's good. We have about 10 minutes left, and we have a couple questions from the audience. And so just picking up on what you were saying, so people can't afford to live in Toronto. They won't if they are talented enough, which most people who want to come to Toronto are. They will move somewhere else. And so one of the questions from the audience was, what are some comparable cities globally that are leading, that are leaders in dealing with housing supply? So zoning, procedures, approvals, and I guess just kind of rapid fire. Maybe I'll start with Kris. In your opinion, what are some leading global cities that are really checking all boxes?
Yeah, I mean, I think Mike and Eric are probably better, prepared for that kind of a question. I can say, when we were doing our jurisdictional scans, looking at team-based models, right, there's a couple of cities that came up, and from that state level I mentioned earlier, that was a Finland idea. Australia has some really neat ideas in terms of, when housing is seen as kind of or when specific applications meet some kind of economic or strategic threshold, state actors actually kind of take over and move the project through. There's interesting ideas like that, but I'll keep it quick, and I think punt that over to Mike or Eric, who probably know way more than I do in that space.
I'll let Mike go first since I just talked for a bit.
Yeah, absolutely. So I added those ones. Minneapolis is doing some interesting things as well. But I also think we need to look at, again, doing this sort of province-wide. The state of California has had a number of bills to allow for more density, faster approvals process, things like that. So, I do think we need to be looking more province-wide, again, because you can have a small community in Ontario. They can do all the right things. They're just going to have more people moving in from the GTA. So I think the solutions ultimately are going to have to be provincial, but certainly I would love to see that the cities also raise, the municipalities raise their games as well.
Yeah, I mean, just to jump in there and make a little joke, I do talk about the brain drain, but personally I wouldn't move to Texas or Alberta. But yeah, so back to your point, Mike, about looking at what we're already doing within the province as opposed to globally. But
well, I think there are good jurisdictional examples. I mean, I think for places that have housing crises, California is really showing that the action needs to be at the state level. I spent a couple of years living in San Francisco, as did over 70% of my classmates from Waterloo, right? Left the GTA and left Canada in general for the economic opportunities that even still are actually better relative to the cost of housing. And San Francisco municipal politics, I would describe as utterly hopeless, right? If you left it up to San Francisco, things would not change. And I think that's why you're seeing state level action, both as necessary and required. And I would say the same is true of Toronto. In terms of cities that are doing a good job on this, I think it's really easy to look at places like, I'd say like New Zealand is bringing in some reforms. Australia is doing some innovative stuff, but those are all places that have already destroyed their housing markets by being bad in the first place. What you should be looking at is cities that don't have housing crises, that do have a lot of people and are cities. So, to me, looking at jurisdictions like Tokyo, which famously had a housing crisis, a lot of it was local, and then the national government came in and said, look, this is broken. We're just going to rip out this system from your hands. We're going to create a new set of policies that give some leeway but not the full discretion that they had once before. And while there are a lot of other macroeconomic factors affecting Tokyo, population growth not actually being one of them, which I hear a lot, there's a lot to learn from how they reformed land use planning. I also think jurisdictions that have a high degree of investment in mixed income, but public housing, where they're leveraging government properties to build housing that meets the needs of their cities, actually makes sense. And I think it can complement the private market in a lot of critical areas, because in places like Toronto, you're actually seeing the private market be asked to provide some of these social good functions, which I don't actually think that they are best suited toward. So places like Vienna, or even Paris, for example, are doing a lot of really innovative stuff on mixed market but public housing. You can also look at a lot of cities that are well planned, right, where density is legal basically by right. And you can look at cities in Spain, I think, as a very good example. For example, Barcelona, that has done a very good job in its urban planning and moves people and houses people quite affordably relative to the incomes there. So I think there are a lot of excellent examples around the world. I mean, we can even look at some in Canada, like Edmonton. Edmonton's like the first major city to end exclusionary zoning, and they did it before they have a housing crisis because they don't want one. And that's a political decision. So, yes, we can look at a lot of this jurisdiction around the world, but the truth is, and to our government ministers provincially and politicians locally, you know what you need to do at this point. Like, you do know what you need to do. You just gotta do it.
Yeah, I'm still not moving. You haven't convinced me on the Alberta piece, though. Yeah. So we have 4 minutes left, and I have 2 questions. So I really do want to get through both. The first one is from the audience, and it regards consultation. So on the subject of convincing homeowners, so many decisions about housing at the municipal level are made through consultation only with existing residents, and often a small subset of those. How do we include the needs and perspectives of future residents in housing decisions at the consultation level?
Well, I think we just need to change where the line in the sand is between what is consulted and what it's not. I could tear down my house in the Glebe in Ottawa and build a McMansion, and nobody's opinion matters. But if I wanted to replace it with a duplex and triplex and maybe have my parents move into one of the units, then all of a sudden my neighbors get a say. That to me seems extremely backwards, and that in a housing crisis, McMansions, no consultation, actually doing something to solve the housing crisis, neighborhood vetoes. I think we need to flip that on its head.
I'd echo Mike. I would say, I think neighborhoods should be consulted on growth as a neighborhood, right? Like, how should we manage this? I don't think having project by project fights makes all that much sense unless the projects are very large. In general, the rules should be by right so that building on that property is economically viable within the guidelines that are already established. Zoning should not be used as a bargaining chip to fight for arbitrary asks from developers. It's bad for everyone involved in the process. So, the best way to solve this is to have clear rules and for the decisions to seem fair, right? If everything is arbitrary, then everything's influenceable.
And then my last question, and it's a long one, so hopefully we can answer it within 2 minutes. But some municipal jurisdictions feel the development fee refund, which was introduced in Bill 109, More Homes for Everyone, is an impractical consequence and punitive in nature. If the development fee refund were not to be pursued, what other realistic mechanisms could expedite the approval process, considering the current realities that face municipal planning departments with respect to prolonged approval timeframes? Long question. Kris, maybe do you want to start with that one?
I can start briefly. I mean, I know that Bill 109 is obviously being talked a lot about now at the municipal level. Personally, I think about the housing task force report, and I see some other elements in there that I think are interesting, right? Like the city of Toronto benefited from the streamlined development approval fund the report talks about the fact that they are looking to advocate with the federal government for more funding. I think those are positives. Those are realistic and kind of represent an all of government approach, all community approach. So I think those are things that are realistic. And then programs like Concept of Keys. I think you will see a reduction in timelines in Toronto based on technology improvements, based on process improvements, and all those things that are now being daylighted. So I'd say, again, not try to plug the program too much, but I'd leave it at that.
And then last words, yeah.
I have a simple one for that. If municipalities are unhappy that the taxes per unit on new builds are going down because of something the province did, there's a great solution. Have more units being built and you'll raise the same amount of tax revenue you did before. That's the goal. That's what we're trying to accomplish.
And then Mike, any comments there?
So I'll just echo Kris and Eric. I know we're running low on time, so I would just say I'm in full agreement.
Perfect. So thank you, Mike, Eric, and Kris. I'm sure I'll get lots of questions. I don't know, maybe my phone was listening to me and I'll get more move to Alberta ads, but we'll see. Anyways, please join us for our next session, How to Achieve Widespread Choice in Housing, with Michael Giles, Ian Underwood, David Amborski, and Ben Dacus. They will be discussing solutions to provide more choice in the housing market, including affordable housing and rental. To access the session, please navigate to the agenda and open the session. We'll see you shortly. Thank you. Thanks, everyone.